All right. Thanks for your patience, everybody. My name is Melissa Wenzel. I'm the Built Environment Sustainability Administrator for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I've been in this role for almost 4 years now, and for anybody who knows me, it's a job that I absolutely love. And part of it is because you all are doing great work, and my day job is to remove barriers from your efforts and to uplift you all. So that's one of the easiest things I've ever done in my life, is to support others. And being able to do so means a lot to me. So that being said, let me go ahead and share my presentation. So welcome. Like I said, we have a really full agenda, and we're going to be covering a lot of topics with a couple of our guest speakers who happen to be at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So today, autoplay apparently. Today we'll be hearing from Greg Cavall, who will be giving us an update on the rulemaking process for construction and demolition solid waste landfill disposal facilities, otherwise known as landfills. We have our intern who's been working with us all summer, Jennifer Vang, who's going to give us an update about her internship, as well as the developments that she's working on for a deconstruction ordinance template. I and others will go through some updates that include funding secured through the legislative budget, deconstruction toolkit that partners from Rethos created, and talk about some adaptive reuse successes presentations that we're giving. At that point, we'll allow people to give updates themselves if we have time, and we might not. And folks, if you're not speaking, I'm going to go ahead and mute you, or please go ahead and mute yourself. Hearing some throat clearing and stuff like that, which not a big deal, but throws me off a little bit, probably does others as well. So thanks for being thoughtful on that. So again, great agenda today. We have a lot to cover, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Greg. Feel free to continue to chat your introduction so that other people can get to know you. Again, name, organization, where you are, and what brought you here. And Greg, I will move over to your presentation in just a sec. I have just
All right, hi everyone. As Melissa mentioned, I'm Greg Cavall. I'm a senior solid waste engineer at the MPCA. I'm also the beneficial use coordinator for the state, and I'm the lead of the construction and demolition rule writing group, which is tasked with updating the construction and demolition landfill rules. Next slide. Oop, that one, there we go. The goals of this rulemaking are to make the necessary changes to how C&D landfills are designed, constructed, where they're sited, and how they are managed and operated, to address any negative impacts to groundwater, and to make sure the new rules don't risk public health, safety, or the environment, and to make sure our rules encourage and not hinder material reuse, recycling, or sustainable building efforts. Next. We use several information sources to develop what we're calling the major rule concepts, and which we'll go into in a minute. But first of all, we impaneled a rule advisory panel to advise us in development of the rules, and I'll talk more about them later. We worked alongside the Sustainable Building Group, headed up by Melissa. We surveyed Region 5 and bordering states to see how they were managing C&D materials and why. And most of them, it was because they had groundwater issues, which they were seeing. We looked at the current C&D and municipal solid waste rules, our statement of need and reasonableness that was written during the past rulemaking, or SONAR, and our state statutes governing groundwater and waste management. We also looked at a guidance document, including the 2005 demolition landfill guidance, which was written because the rules written in 1988 governing C&D landfills weren't really adequate in doing the job. So guidance was written to try and help with that. We used the 2019 C&D landfill groundwater report, which was written by Alex Hokinson and others, which showed impacts to groundwater from basically all of the C&D, unlined C&D landfill facilities. And we use internal staff and resources, other engineers, hydros, other people in our agency. Next slide. In the fall of 2019, we kicked off the rulemaking effort with a joint meeting with what we're calling the Rule Advisory Panel and the Sustainable Building Group. The Rule Advisory Panel consists of county officials, public and private landfill owners and operators, consultants, environmental groups, and private citizens. Over the past 3 years, we've been picking their brains on how to best manage C&D materials and protect the environment at the same time. We had our last official meetings over the past 2 months where we presented our major rule concepts for C&D landfills to them. Next slide. So our rulemaking timeline from this point forward is to first write the draft rules, and then we send them to our legal team for review. Next slide. Then we plan to present the draft rules to a wider group of stakeholders, which might include the Rule Advisory Panel, environmental groups, counties, you folks, I guess, if you're interested. Then we'll prepare a notice of intent to adopt the rules and then begin all the legal things, hearings, comment periods, and stuff like that, which I won't go into in much more detail, but that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, and we're just hoping to get to that point. So we'll leave it at that. Next slide. And now we come to the major rule concepts which we've developed, and these include an enhanced or impermeable landfill covers, covers that would go over landfills as they close, line facilities with leachate collection. So these would be liners underneath the waste that are able to collect leachate, which then can be pumped up and managed rather than going into the groundwater. We're proposing financial assurance, which would apply to all land disposal facilities, including C&D landfills, and that's to ensure proper closure and post-closure, that there's money available for those. And we're proposing more stringent closure and post-closure standards. And then we're proposing the elimination of construction and demolition permit by rule facilities, or PBRs. And these are allowed in rule. They're mainly smaller facilities that are actually sited throughout Minnesota. Some of them are concentrated in just a few counties in kind of north central Minnesota, but they're allowed to operate basically without really much oversight, regulatory oversight. So we are proposing to eliminate those because they're basically just, kind of small unlined landfills. We're also proposing to update operating requirements, location standards, and requiring groundwater monitoring at all C&D land disposal facilities. Next. So the facts supporting our proposed rules include, but are not limited to, that groundwater is a highly valuable, probably Minnesota's most valuable resource, yet it's a very sensitive resource, which is almost impossible to reclaim once it's polluted. We found that C&D materials are not inert as once believed when the rules were written. There's very few materials that are, quote, inert in the sense that they don't have the potential to cause, impact to human health and the environment or groundwater. The 2019 groundwater report, which I mentioned earlier, showed that all unlined landfills were currently impacting groundwater or will be in the future. It's just a matter of time, unless there's some kind of barrier between the fill and the groundwater. Groundwater monitoring of C&D facilities has found a variety of contaminants, including VOCs, other metals, PFAS, and et cetera, I guess. We found that protecting groundwater is, in the first place, is a lot better than trying to reclaim it. Like I mentioned earlier, once pollutants get into groundwater, it's almost impossible to clean it up. And our non-degradation rules don't allow groundwater to be polluted beyond its highest potential use, and that is its use as drinking water. So that's kind of just a summary of some of the major facts that we're looking at when we came up with these major concepts. Next slide. So I'll go into a little more detail on what we're proposing. The current cover design in the current rules, they're very lax as they assumed an inert waste stream. We're proposing prescriptive design and or performance-based cover criteria. We're proposing that the cover should meet or exceed the permeability of the liner underneath it. And that's so the landfill doesn't have a bathtub effect. In other words, there isn't water pooling, but it'd be shed by the liner rather than basically to minimize leachate generation in the first place. And we'd allow, oops, I think we skipped back. There we go. We'd allow flexibility with synthetic or natural materials. If there's a lot of clay on site or nearby, they could use that rather than some sort of synthetic cover. And it's basically these requirements are to minimize leachate generation in the first place. Next slide. The current rules don't include requirements for liners for C&D facilities. But what we're proposing is prescriptive design and performance standards. The liner needs to be able to collect and manage leachate. And again, we would allow synthetic and or natural materials. And this is basically just protection of the environment and drinking water. And these are just standard landfill engineering practices to line and cover and contain any type of solid waste. Next. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next several slides, but let's just say we're proposing to strengthen the way C&D landfills are operated, basically to minimize minimize and manage leachate as it's generated. Next slide. We would strengthen the location standards to ensure the ability to monitor groundwater and minimize environmental impacts. Right now, the standards for siting a facility have been very lax, and basically a lot of the C&D landfills were located in places where they shouldn't have been, like a mined out gravel pit or sand pit or something of that, where permeability of the material is pretty high. So that that hasn't helped. So citing criteria would be strengthened. Next. Right now, about 80% of the facilities have groundwater monitoring networks. Some of those are maybe a little bit inadequate, but we're proposing that all facilities, land disposal facilities, including C&D facilities, should be required to have groundwater monitoring that to measure potential impacts and the flow of groundwater and that type of thing. Next. I had mentioned financial assurance, and currently the current rule, financial assurance can be required of C&D landfills by commissioner's discretion, but most of the online landfills do not have financial assurance. So what we are proposing is requiring financial assurance of all land disposal facilities, basically to cover future liabilities and closure and post-closure of all land disposal facilities, and I guess consistency across the board for land disposal facilities. Next slide. Right now, the current requirements for closure and post-closure, again, are fairly inadequate. Again, assuming an inert waste when the rules were written, there wasn't much they had to do to close, and they still don't have to do to close because the rules are currently in effect. So we would strengthen closure and post-closure requirements, basically to minimize leachate generation and minimize future liabilities. Next slide. I mentioned getting rid of permit by rule facilities, which have had a lack of oversight, and they're just not protective of the environment. Right now, about 90%, a lot of them are rejected just due to the proposed location is unacceptable for even the minimum rules that permit by rule facilities are required to follow. So most of them can't be built where they want to be built anyways, so getting rid of them might not be have too much of an impact on the overall system. Next slide. Transition. There'll be several options for transitioning to a new system depending on what they have now and what they plan to transition to. Next slide. They could close the online landfill and continue to operate but move to a lined system, or they could close the online landfill and move to a different C&D management method altogether, including transfer stations or other things. Next slide. So under this scenario, this would be, they could close the online landfill and build a new lined cell or lined landfill, and we would give them time to continue to operate in order to generate funds to transition to a lined facility. So the facilities that want to continue to operate over a certain amount of time, they would have to, depending on what they choose to do, they would have to close up any unlined cells, and then over a period of time transition to a lined cell or a whole new line facility. Next slide. Or they could close their unlined landfill altogether and move to a different management system, which I mentioned might include a transfer station to transfer materials to a lined facility. And again, we would give them time to transition to a new system. this type of systems, I guess both of them could include, some of the sustainable building practices that you guys have been working on, deconstruction, but I'll get to that stuff in a minute. We hope the new rules will not hinder any attempts to divert materials from either the landfill or the transfer facilities, or what do they propose to transfer to. There are several regional groups in Minnesota right now that have regional solid waste management systems, and some of them are already planning or looking to how they're going to kind of change their regional system to come into compliance with these proposed new rules. Next slide. So we are proposing a 7-year transition period to move from an unlined system to an all-lined system. So we would allow facilities before promulgation of the rule, the facilities can close under the current rules. And that would basically be just covered with 2 feet of soil. They're not really designed to protect the groundwater, and they could be basically walk away from the facilities before promulgation of this new rule. But they may be in perpetual post-closure and have perpetual liability. So we're not recommending that option, but it's open to facilities now to be able to do that. We would give facilities who want to put on an enhanced cover or close with more environmental protection up to maybe like 4 years to be able to generate funds and make a plan to cover and close in a more environmentally sustainable manner. And then we're proposing to give up to 7 years for basically the most environmentally protective cover, final cover requirement that would reject most or all or most of leachate generation and minimize leachate generation. And then after that, that would all, after 7 years, basically all unlined landfills should be gone in Minnesota and should be transitioned to a new system. These timelines are still negotiable. There's nothing set in stone here. Again, this is proposed rules and nothing that's set in stone yet. But we think these are reasonable given the cost and time to implement some of these different systems. Next slide. So sustainable building recommendations. We're hoping that the transition to a new system will not only include but incentivize a move towards more sustainable building practices, more deconstruction activity, and more reuse and recycling of C&D materials. And I don't know if Melissa wants to add anything to this slide since she's the SBG person, the sustainable person. Or not.
These are definitely goals that we have that we're going to be working in tandem alongside with what you're doing, Greg. We know that a lot of these activities happen upstream of actual landfill disposal facilities, and so we'll continue to work on initiatives that reduce the amount of waste that's going to landfills. We'll certainly encourage also landfill owners to consider some diversion opportunities or reuse programs that a lot of our local governments are starting to adopt. So all of it is TBD, but obviously we'll have some updates that highlight some successes a little bit later today.
Sorry to put you on the spot there, but what we're hoping too is like when some of these, transfer facilities are being planned, that they will plan for diversion of materials as they come into a transfer station. states have done things of that kind. Iowa has what they call citizen convenience centers, where citizens can drop off materials, say, windows, uh, good 2x4s or other building materials that can be reused or recycled, but then also have a place to put materials, basically a dumpster, for ultimate disposal. Because in the end, there's always going to be something that's going to be left over that needs to go to a kind of a final end disposal facility. And again, we're hoping, let's face it, an online facility is going to be more costly to operate and maintain. Right now, the online landfills are basically just a hole in the ground, and there's really not much cost to maintain them, because other than, cleaning up the groundwater, which a lot of them haven't gotten to yet, which would definitely add a cost and a liability. But so, possibly the diversion of materials will help, as far as cut the costs of ultimate disposal. And that's about all I had. I don't know if I have questions.
Yeah, at least one popped up in chat, and I imagine others might have questions too.
Oh, sorry, I haven't been watching the chat. I should probably do that.
It just came in. Brad Guy is asking, are you concerned about methane generation leakage from organics or cover designed around that? Also, Mount Trashmore is something he's focusing on. Brad, feel free to take yourself off mute if you would like to chat somewhere.
Yeah, we're considering that. Right now, most C&D landfills don't take in much, or materials that generate a lot of methane. We don't know exactly what the facility categories are going to be. Some, like the state of Iowa, they have facilities that they just incorporated them all into one system, or they take municipal solid waste as well as C&D materials. And there you would definitely have to consider methane management and some sort of ventilation systems. There may be facilities that restrict themselves. They'll have to be lined and covered, but they'll restrict themselves to basically materials that don't generate as much methane. And some of those facilities may not require or need ventilation for methane. But we're still working on that and working through that. How is it estimated that all C&D landfills will pose eventual groundwater contamination? Well, our rules require that facilities not contaminate the groundwater beyond its highest use, which is drinking water. So far, unfortunately, we've been kind of lax in enforcing that because a lot of facilities have been contaminating groundwater up to the point where 3 facilities have impacted residential wells to the point where they need bottled water and such. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these facilities may be in like perpetual post-closure, where they're continuing to have to monitor and or remediate or mitigate the groundwater impacts that have already been caused or may be caused in the future. We haven't quite sorted that out yet, and I would refer you to Alex Hokinson and maybe our compliance enforcement folks that may be tasked with dealing with that in the future. And it might be a management decision too, is how far we take this to clean up groundwater that's already been contaminated or will be. Can you give some pertaining to your recommendations? I don't know, Melissa, you might be better to answer that question. Can you give some specifics pertaining to your recommendations for keeping construction materials in the economy?
Where to start? There's a million and one different ways to do that. And I know, Brad, you and I have talked too. We at state government recognize, again, removing barriers, incentivizing opportunities, providing awareness to the successes that are going on. And that's something that we've had a solid 3-year commitment, 3+ year commitment working on. And this particular legislative session, we actually asked for quite a bit of money, both from the material, the recycling market side of things, reuse marketplace as well, and also for incentivizing deconstruction training and being able to use these grant opportunities. So there's a lot of opportunities out there. It's almost endless, partly because there aren't any regulations specifically, but a lot of it does take building relationships to get that awareness out, to bring people together in meetings like this, and so on. So we'll cover some of that a little bit later today.
There are, I don't know how many, there are a couple businesses that I know of that are operating now, like Better Futures Minnesota, which they do deconstruction currently, and then they have a materials warehouse where I've been through it several times. They have light fixtures and appliances and all sorts of stuff that can be resold. And it helps disadvantaged, basically men at this point, get job experience and things like that. So it's a really impressive operation going on right there. Hopefully that can continue to operate and thrive and maybe be a model. I know it's a lot more difficult in outstate or other areas, but we're hoping some of that will take hold statewide.
One comment, and then also one question just came in. So a comment from Bread Guy, Florida closed hundreds of landfills in the 90s because of groundwater contamination. Not a scientist, there are reactions in the soil chemistry with materials. Also, don't forget asbestos and lead and heavy metals that are all over C&D materials that get through, especially from residential work. And it's also,
So I think that's getting to the point of, yeah, there are naturally occurring metals and other things that are in the soil. And basically, if you disturb the soil, they can be transported into the groundwater and the environment. And that's true of, all the C&D, unlined C&D landfills across the state. We're seeing that with arsenic and manganese around these facilities. But as I mentioned, there's also PFAS, there's VOCs, and those other metals, and those materials are, they're man-made. They're not from the environment. So the groundwater study focused on arsenic, boron, and manganese, basically as indicators that the facilities were leaking. But our groundwater monitoring and monitoring of leachate has shown that there's so many other contaminants in the leachate that those that are in the environment already are just part of the impact.
Sherry, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
I was just gonna continue what Greg said for Crystal's question about, how is it estimated that C&Ds will pose eventual groundwater contamination issues? Is that the 2018 white paper documented a majority of the landfills in that report that had an adequate groundwater monitoring system, that 3/4 of them were impacting drinking water standards. Since that time, we went back and reevaluated the ones that weren't, and they were also impacting the groundwater above drinking water standards. And I can't tell you if it was just ILs or hurls or what, but basically it's eventually, if they don't show it now, all will be showing impact to the groundwater above what Greg said, the highest use, which is drinking water. So I just wanted to tack on with what Greg talked about is how do we know? We know from our white paper and current data.
And what other states have seen. Basically, all the other states that are looking for it have found it. And our neighbors to the west, we interviewed them and they basically said the only reason they haven't seen groundwater impacts is they're not looking for it. They're not monitoring. So anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
thank
great.
you both for that.
Go ahead, Crystal.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you. I'm gonna try to find that paper. I think that'll be really interesting. I was just curious because you know, if I bring this up, I'm sure people will be asking questions about it. So thank you so much.
Crystal, are you able to access chat? I know that not everybody can as a guest, but I did throw the link for the white paper into chat.
Okay, thank you. I'll get it.
Great. Well, we still have a full agenda, so thank you, Greg and Sherry, for your additions too. Thank you so much for giving us an update. And I know it's a little bit of a different topic for us to cover, but we thought that with the Rural Advisory Panel staff and work group members meeting earlier this month, as recently as last week, we thought it was fair to provide an update to this group as well. So feel free to reach out to Greg directly if you have any more questions.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Greg. Next up, we have Jennifer Vang, a student at the University of Minnesota, who's going to talk about her internship experience as well as one development she's working on. And Jennifer, are you going to share your own screen or would you like me to?
I'll share my own screen.
Okay, great. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Am I sharing the presentation or the, okay, awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer. It's a pleasure to meet you all. And today I'll be speaking about my internship experience at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency thus far. So just a little background. I am an upcoming 5th year at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I'm majoring in Sustainable Systems Management, which is an interdisciplinary course between business and science. The main focuses are just to create a balance between public health, the environment, and the economy. I'm also a fellow through Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa, and so through their program, the IDEC program, which stands for Increasing Diversity in Environmental Careers, I was able to land this internship opportunity. So my current position is called a Sustainable Built Environment intern. I started working in May, and I have been working closely with Melissa since. Here's a picture of us at the Better Futures deconstruction site, which I will get to eventually. But I work a hybrid schedule, so on the days where I'm not in the office or working remotely, I'm attending site visits. If you've read the Summer Minnesota's Built Environment Digest newsletter, then you may have seen my short article about this day. I visited several reuse and salvage centers throughout the Twin Cities, and I was pleasantly surprised to see how big and passionate the reuse, the reuse and salvage movement was. So Bauer Brothers, Habitat for Humanity, Better Futures, those are just a few to name. And this was followed up by opportunity to see Better Futures deconstruct a mansion and salvage the materials. I did misplace the inventory list, but if I remember correctly, the nonprofit organization probably salvaged or collected about 1,500 or 15,000 pounds of materials, and they diverted that. So it was like 1 or 5. That was what I remember. But anyways, And then last week, I was able to visit the Ramsey Washington Recycling and Energy Center. And although this didn't really revolve around construction and demolition, it was just insightful because although it is a waste facility, and at the end of the process, um, it does try to divert the amount of waste that it receives from the landfills, or it tries to divert as much waste as it can, and they actually convert the waste into energy. And not to mention, they have a compost pilot program in effect, which is um, uh, surrounding organics, where they provide residents with compostable bags, and then these organics can also be thrown into their trash. And later on, when it enters the facilities, it will be organized and removed. So I thought that would just be good news to share. Otherwise, I've worked on a reuse ecosystem matrix database where I just enter data into the map on reuse, salvage, and deconstruction organizations, businesses, and services. As a side project, which is unrelated to sustainable built environment, but also in the environment field, I learned about the health risks of heavy metals. I also learned about the history of toxic chemicals and enforcement, and I was able to go out a few times, purchase skin whitening creams from local shops, and bring it back to the lab to test for mercury vapor. And surprisingly, one of the products that I did purchase ended up having like a really high value, and so the process to remove it from the shelf is in place. Another project that I've been working on is the materials ban list, which I did complete. In this, I researched state disposal bans and mandatory recycling requirements on C&D materials. These included asbestos, asphalt shingles, and pavement, brick, mercury-containing devices, and more. And with that, I was able to update the Northeast Recycling Council's materials ban list for 50 states. And finally, for the biggest project of my internship thus far, I have been working on a deconstruction ordinance draft. And just to introduce this project, building materials, or in the construction and demolition industry, building material plans are not only essential in ensuring progress and completion of a project, but they can also put forth efforts of sustainable initiatives. Building materials is defined as the planning and execution of materials procurement, allocation, and disposal in the building industry. And so when implemented, these waste policies are extremely beneficial since they not only impact the environmental sector, but also the economy and society. These benefits include waste diversion, the reuse and circulation of materials, deconstruction work development, and the creation of green jobs, historic preservation of old buildings and materials, and much, much more. And so the current state of C&D materials in the United States is promising, although the statistics can be a little daunting. The United States generates more than twice the amount of construction and demolition debris than municipal solid waste. Of that, 80% of the debris generated in construction and demolition projects are buried in landfills. This means that only 20% is being reused, salvaged, or recycled. And in Minnesota, this value is about 1.6 million tons. And so this means that there's a big opportunity to reduce waste and the environmental effects, as well as the potential of developing a market for these materials. And so one of the approaches so far that we found is to handle this issue is to implement a C&D ordinance. Currently, many C&D ordinances do exist, but not all states have one, and these policies vary based on the type of government and building involved in the project. For example, in California, the Department of Resources Recycling and Recovery, or also known as CalRecycle, they built a C&D model based off of existing C&D ordinances. And this template was developed to provide maximum flexibility to users, As such, it was adopted and effectively implemented by many jurisdictions throughout the state of California. In the city of Portland, Oregon, this was the first city to create a building type standard-based, in other words, the first city to incorporate historic preservation in their ordinance. So this meant that any building built before 1916 required a demolition permit for deconstruction. And this is a great stepping stone for C&D ordinance, which never considered the fact that historic preservation was significant. And in Massachusetts, a demolition delay bylaw was created to protect these significant historic resources. In this process, an applicant can file to obtain a building demolition permit, and if the historical commission determines that the building is significant, then the building cannot be demolished until during the delay period, and alternatives have to be considered and investigated. Only when the delay has expired, then the building can be demolished. And in Wisconsin, the city of Milwaukee implemented their own ordinance. And although this ordinance has been stalled since, this city is also a great example to learn from, especially surrounding city funding, what works and what doesn't work, especially when it comes to establishing and maintaining a C&D ordinance. And so given how different these 4 policies were, I tried to identify which rules were effective and thus developed a foundation for the ordinance draft, and which reflected the state's goals. This includes reducing environmental and climate impacts from the building sector, preventing building materials from entering landfills, minimizing health risks caused by hazardous building materials, saving communities time and money with the standard framework and terminology, and creating green jobs to promote deconstruction work. And this is all in support of the agency's purpose to revise existing waste policies so that a mandate can be established and become applicable to parties on the local, statewide, and national scale. So this includes tribal nations, counties, municipalities, cities, as well as residential sector, commercial sector, industrial sector. And then the next step from there on would be to have the C&D ordinance adopted in every single state. And so I will be dropping the link to my draft in the comments just to be mindful of time. And hopefully you all can look it over in your free time and provide any feedback or suggestions that you have. I will continue to work on this project until my internship ends in August, so I will greatly appreciate any help that I can get. This may take a second, sorry. Oh, there we go.
There was some great comments about happy knowing that the research included not just the coastal states, and I can certainly echo that, especially for the Midwest, that's kind of important for us to look around and our own regions. So a lot of kudos. I mean, you saw a bunch of clapping, a lot of comments in chat are also
Awesome.
indicating that. I mean,
Yeah.
you are doing work that people that are in the field for 5, 10 or more years are doing, Jennifer. And so it is appreciative of not only what you've learned, but how you're able to process this information to work with me to get us a deliverable product. And so you've just been so great to work with.
Thank you for that, Melissa. Just to conclude my presentation, once again, thank you guys all so much. I will also be dropping my email and LinkedIn in case you have any other questions or just want to get a hold of me.
Oh, do you have the link for
The draft.
the feedback? For the feedback?
Oh, the Padlet? Yes.
Yeah.
I also made comments available on the Google Doc, but I can also
cool.
share the Padlet. Yeah.
Whatever you prefer.
Yeah. Oh, in that case, I'll just stick to the Google Docs. Yeah.
And there was one comment, just a comment, it's complicated in social contextual process elements. Brad, I'm not sure if I fully understand that, but I certainly do believe and agree that it is very complex and complicated and socially driven in addition to systems change.
Yeah, especially the social aspect of it. Not sure how to incorporate like environmental justice yet into an ordinance, but hopefully it can be developed. Yeah.
Is it okay to say something?
Of course. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, that obviously a key driver. I was thinking more of, I don't know, the Midwest versus the Sun Belt. There's political, how do I say, biases, and then there's everything from the type of waste streams you might have. There's, and I guess just to tell the story, to my knowledge, the whole Portland thing happened a lot because of historic preservation concerns and gentrification, and some guy actually chained himself to an old house at one point because it was going to be demolished, and so it became a sort of community cause to say, hey, slow down, you're demolishing too many buildings, what can we do about this? And that helped drive the deconstruction, which obviously isn't really, it's not preventing a demolition, but it's a sort of in-between path. And, you know, just to say that's kind of some driver that was really unique about the development in Portland and the aggression of, you know, a lot of tear downs and things like that. So how each community might do this might vary. It just, you know, is it top down? Is it ground up? Like that might be considered a more grassroots type thing.
And you're right with the complexity of this topic. So as somebody who's been in this program at the state of Minnesota since September 2019, and I met some of you at the Builders Conference just a month later, it is complex. It takes resources to support the market, to support, say, deconstruction training or preservation opportunities, to support awareness and education. And to be honest, one comment that I received pretty early on was from a rural advisory panel stakeholder person who challenged to not tip the scale in one direction or another too hard. And I believe we've been fairly thoughtful to support in maybe smaller steps, different initiatives. So creating ordinance templates, trying to encourage some of these deconstruction grant programs, seeking funding for government entities that can't, that don't have the funds for it. And we've had partners volunteer to lead efforts without us even asking. And we're going to talk about one of those tools just a little bit later. So it is complex, and that's a system. So system change means we have to change a lot of different parts of the system. And in our case, we're choosing to do small parts all at once. Are there other questions or comments? I see that Jory from Urban Machine put in the deconstruction requirements for Portland, which of course we've used as a model. And before Sean Wood left the city of Portland, I was able to talk with him about deconstruction certification. And of course, he's still willing to talk with us now that he's basically doing the same job at EPA. So. Anything else? Well, Jennifer definitely represents the desire and willingness to help with systems change. She hasn't necessarily decided to go into the building material reuse world or anything like that, but I'm hoping that this experience for her gave her an opportunity to learn about one part of sustainable systems and how one person, one intern can actually make a difference that ripples across the nation.
Thank you, Melissa.
All right, so I'm going to take back control because I have some updates and I've alluded to several of them, so I'd love to be able to talk with them. So let me go back to sharing my screen. the most time I spend on presentations is about finding the right photos. So that's what I was still doing today. On this building material reuse store tour that Jennifer and I went on, we eye candy galore. We saw lots of really, really, really cool things. And we know how rich the community is in Minnesota and beyond for salvaging and reuse of both historic and standard building materials. So some of our current developments do include focusing on funding. It's something that I've been bringing up at a couple of these meetings, and I'm happy to give an update on that. We have a partner program from Rethos, and we have a Green Corps member there who is absolutely enamored with all things deconstruction and material reuse. And he took it upon himself to create a deconstruction toolkit. Josh, I didn't ask you to speak because we already had 2 guest speakers. I saw that you were on earlier. If you do want to talk about it and you're still here, because I can no longer see my participation list, feel free to, but I'm happy to also sing praises on that. And then finally, we're going to wrap up on some presentations that is really catching on for attention these days about adaptive reuse. So I believe my initial pitch was for $3 million. Like, things happen so fast, and yet I've been working on this for almost a year at this point. I don't really remember the beginning stages, but we have secured for this biennium $2 million for sustainable buildings and material programs and projects here in Minnesota. And I'm hoping that people who represent the building material reuse world, the building reuse world, deconstruction, even those that work at construction, demolition, landfills, that you recognize that we are putting our commitment to this topic by requesting funding and securing funding from our state budget. And this was a statement, I think it got modified slightly within the telephone game from me to the governor's budget. This is lifted straight out of the governor's budget draft from January 2023 and updated in March. And it is in law, so this is now real as of July 1st. So we are going to be focusing on incentives to change how much construction and demolition debris we send to our landfills. We know that there are 3 official counties in the metropolitan area that offer deconstruction and/or building material reuse grants. Those counties are Hennepin County, Ramsey County, and Washington County, representing a fairly large chunk of our population, but certainly not representing the majority of Minnesota. And we know that a lot of other counties would wish to, or tribal nations would wish to offer these grant opportunities if they had the funding for it. So I have not had a chance to finalize what we're going to have for priority projects or which, what are the functions of this particular grant cycle. That is something that's next on my list of things to do. And I anticipate that we're going to be rolling out the grant cycle process later this fall. So there's not a lot I can talk about, 1, because I literally have nothing else to share, but 2, there's a certain point where everybody will have to get their information from the same sort of grant page on our MPCA website. There's a lot of legal ramifications about making sure that everybody has the same information, has access to the same information, and any questions that you have cannot go to me. There's going to be an email address that is connected to our grant program managers that will receive it and make sure the response is neutral and/or the same for everybody who asks it. So I anticipate we'll have some online training sessions or workshops where people can hear about these and ask their questions, but all of that will happen for everyone at the same time. So it's not as if I can select or even want to select specific projects. That's not how competitive grants work. And we want to make sure that everybody has an equal chance to at least get the information and apply for the grant. That said, are there any questions that I might be able to answer, depending on what your question is? I'll throw my screen up so I can see if there are any questions. Thank you. I will say that I know what the outcome would have been if we hadn't asked for money. Now, here in Minnesota, we did have some of the, I think we had a record surplus coming off of the pandemic. We were pretty fiscally conservative during the pandemic seasons. And we also had elected officials that really were very conscious and very thoughtfully minded about climate adaptation, climate needs, waste reduction efforts, and so on. So things really worked out. Brad, I'm just starting to catch back up with your comment. Can you talk about the figure of $5,000 per house? I'm not quite sure where that's coming from. Oh, from Hennepin County. You must have jumped to their website and learned a little bit more. I did see Olivia from Hennepin County on the call earlier. Olivia, are you still around and have a few moments to share with us?
Yep, I'm here. I am logged in from my phone, so I can't see the chat and the screen at the same time. What was the?
So Brad wrote, can you talk about the figure of $5,000 per house, how that was derived? I don't live in Minnesota, and that was specific to Hennepin County, the deconstruction grant program.
Yeah, yep. So we offer up to $5,000 maximum for residential structures, and then up to $10,000 for commercial structures. And both of those numbers are based on the project size that is being funded, and it comes down to $2 per square foot. So if it were, say, a 1,200 square foot house, that property would be eligible for $2,400. And yeah, we came up with that amount based on at the time when we were developing the program, demo costs, I believe, this is just off the top of my head, were $5 to $6 per square foot, and deconstruction costs were more like $11 to $13 per square foot. And we wanted to add that $2 per square foot funding to not necessarily make it even with even cost with demo at this point, but make it more comparable so that folks could be incentivized to choose deconstruction instead of demo on their projects. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, Brad, I'd be happy to set up some time to talk in more detail.
Yep, it is a bit of an in-between, for sure.
Okay. I've done this for 30 years, and so I usually track the cost for all the projects I've done. So I've done similar ideas. What is the difference between a demo and a deconstruction? And as you know, again, it's variable based on where you are, low labor, high labor, union cost, and government versus non-government. So I guess to summarize, it's somewhat random. Is that a fair statement? Although it's kind of, I mean, it's just a number. It sounds like that's some number that's helpful, but not meant to be offsetting completely. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I can jump in a little bit to say also that part of it is to see if there are a number of opportunities that they can fund. So if you were to, let's say, have one homeowner who wants to deconstruct a very, very large house that's high end, then that could wipe out the funding. I think they have about $100,000 total per year. And so part of it is also just making sure that multiple requests can be honored. And
Okay.
Hennepin County is the one county in Minnesota that does 3 different programs within this umbrella program. Washington and Ramsey County, the counties to the east of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, all 3 of them offer funding for deconstruction for both commercial and residential projects, and then also structural moves. We know those are uncommon, but fairly expensive, and mostly because of the actual move process itself, which is mostly related to permitting and moving wires and that sort of safety issue. But Hennepin County also offers funds to use used building materials. And that's a model that really spoke to me in terms of things I'd like to see if possible. So it allows for up to 3 different opportunities within Hennepin County.
Yep, and the structural move grants actually are a maximum of $15,000, recognizing that those projects do cost even more than deconstruction typically.
That's right. Thanks.
And pretty soon it's going to be just raise the building wherever you are.
Yeah. No. Does that answer your questions, Brad?
I can have some in the weeds, but maybe I can follow up. Thanks so much.
Cool. I can connect you too. I'll be happy to do so. So questions are coming in to me about the funding. Is the state of Minnesota providing the $2 million per biennium secured in perpetuity? And the ideal would be yes. Right now, this is only focused on a 2-year snapshot. So a term that I never really heard before, or rather never listened to, is whether or not funding has tails, meaning it continues throughout future cycles. I don't believe this one has tails. We do tend to have environmental assistance grants. It's a very generic title for our grant programs here in Minnesota, but there's no guarantee that we'll get to repeat this funding specifically for the built environment. You know that as long as I'm in the program, I'm certainly going to try for it though. Caroline McFadden, who works for the Office of Enterprise Sustainability here in Minnesota, asks, sorry if I missed this, but can any of the $2 million be used for state-owned buildings? To be determined. We have not focused on eligibility yet or applicability, so I can't say either way. Yeah. I want to be more inclusive than exclusive, but still haven't made any of those determinations yet at this point. So, thanks, Jory, for your cheerleading. I'm very happy to get to know you from Urban Machine. If you don't know what Urban Machine is, go ahead and Google it, and it is an amazing tool that might be a game changer for reusing wood lumber products that were once used and thought unusable again. Great. So I'm going to continue on. Feel free to reach out to me if folks have questions. But I'd love to be able to highlight, and Josh, I did see you come on view briefly. You never know who you're going to inspire when you do the work you're doing, and especially with the genuine enthusiasm that we have built here in Minnesota. So we have the nonprofit, Jennifer referred to it earlier, the Building Preservation Nonprofit for Minnesota, Rethos. We've been working with Rethos pretty much since I joined the program because we have so much overlap between building preservation and reuse of buildings, historic preservation, and needing building materials available for preservation purposes. So Green Corps member Josh decided, obviously with management support from Rethos, to create a deconstruction toolkit. Do you want to talk more about that, Josh, if you're still on?
Yeah, I don't have too much to say other than if you know someone who needs some questions answered in one stop, then send them to the toolkit. It was I had a great time working on this resource. You know, it was pretty daunting being a young new person in the field with so much content and so many initiatives happening. I feel like I couldn't possibly include them all. But it was so exciting to do this toolkit, and I really hope that it's a helpful resource for people who have buildings of any size, any characteristic. I think my biggest takeaway, and I know that other people will think this too, is it's just such a collaborative field, working in waste and material reuse. And it's, I think, in my mind, just getting started. I'm having a great time. As Melissa said, I'm absolutely enthralled in this world. So I'll definitely do what I can to keep supporting it. And Rethos, the management there, it was on, I think, one of my first few days. They said that they are looking for ways to bring preservation and sustainability more together. So deconstruction, of course, is the best way to begin with, first of all. So all I can say is keep an eye out. I think there's a lot of really exciting work to come. So yeah, that's all I have. Please look at the toolkit. Send me feedback. The Green Corps position ends in just a few weeks, so if you have anything urgent, please reach out. I'd love to hear and love to work with you.
A parallel tool that Josh and I had been thinking of and are working towards is having a Minnesota specific map that allows for one specific thing. So we love maps, we love to showcase who's doing what where, but we wanted to focus on the various programs, the government-led programs that are connected to the built environment world. So we have the counties that offer deconstruction grants. We have some cities that are and townships that have reuse programs for building materials. We have an area centered around Duluth, Minnesota that does both of those sort of things. And that list is growing. So sometimes it's the demand of architects actually that drives some of these activities. They want to know where the funding opportunities are so that they can talk with their clients about perhaps some cost savings or material sourcing and straight from government programs themselves. So that's something that's a work in progress. And Josh, I imagine you and I will talk about it tomorrow over lunch when we meet with Jennifer Vang, the intern, together.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And even though this is Minnesota specific, I think a tool like this can be very, very helpful. And obviously, well, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but could be replicated in other states. Is it fair to say, with credit to Rethos, that one could use this and maybe recreate it?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I when I was building it, just to help myself kind of grapple with all of these ideas and all these processes and concepts, I kind of had to make it Minnesota specific just because like I didn't have the time to make it as versatile as possible in terms of being with different states. But the process is the same. A lot of the information will be same, and even if it isn't the same, it'll definitely get people heading in the right direction. So yeah, I mean, this is a resource that of course will help Minnesotans out the most, but hopefully will inspire some great ideas everywhere.
And speaking of great ideas, there's two more that I want to bring up that aren't necessarily on the slide. If you do receive our Gov Delivery newsletter, you may have seen that there's a brand new wiki that Build Reuse, the national organization that encompasses a lot of our work. They're working on, they've already launched it. It's still at the early stages, but there is a Build Reuse wiki where resources and documents like these can go into, so that it's not who you know, it's a one-stop shop source for this information. And so that anybody who's a Build Reuse member, either personally or organizationally, would be able to add content to it. Otherwise, it's a view-only document like a lot of wikis are. And again, it's at the very, very early stages because it just launched a couple weeks ago in a public sense. So I will, if there's a point where I'm not speaking, I'll go ahead and put that into chat. For anybody else that has a link, you're welcome to throw that into chat. But it's one of those ways that we recognize, again, sort of that collaborative sharing of information, knowledge, and tools really kind of helps us all think, oh, Luna, you're on the call. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's just one of those ways that we recognize that by working together, we all do better. I've been saying recently to folks that are new to this arena or new to me being in it, telling folks that as much as I give, for example, this particular workshop today, other workshops, I get as much or more out of it. So everything I put into, I get a lot out of it too. So the other thing I wanted to talk about has now eluded me, and hopefully I'll remember it again. Josh, thank you again for all your work. It's been such a pleasure working with you. Oh, I remember. Speaking of Green Corps, there's an AmeriCorps program, which Green Corps is, an AmeriCorps program called Northern Bedrock. So they are a building preservation AmeriCorps program. And their executive directors reached out to me a few times about opportunities for trying to build their own reuse store. So if you think about it, and I think I mentioned this earlier today, in order to be able to source materials to preserve existing buildings, you need used building materials. And yes, we do have a lot of reuse stores across the state, but They're up in either the Duluth or Ely area. I don't know why. I can't remember it. I keep forgetting to look it up. But they are working on securing a property and or building so that they can have their own reuse store, so that they can have a stock of materials available to work with that AmeriCorps program for building preservation. So again, if you're kind of new to this industry, you can see just how much overlap there is around the system. So I have to give a shout out to somebody who's not on this call. Kristen Mraz-Reese of the MPCA is the one who came up with the term repurposing buildings, turning vacant spaces into community places. I will probably use that. I'll probably wear out that particular title because I love it that much. But we have a number of opportunities, future tense, and we gave a presentation earlier this month with Josh, actually earlier this year with Josh, on talking about the successes of adaptively reusing buildings. And some of this is, we've been talking about it. We know that the greenest building is oftentimes the one that's already built. What actually kind of inspired all of these activities was actually a WCCO Facebook post where there was an interview, or there was a feature about one particular small town elementary school that basically turned into an Airbnb. And so somebody covered that particular story, and all of a sudden, all these people were posting on Facebook all of the buildings, mostly schools, but not exclusively, that had been turned into other uses. A lot of times apartments or condos or senior living. And it just really inspired a really interesting sort of collaborative effort to find out more about these buildings and the cities. Big cities like Minneapolis, small towns like blanking all of a sudden, Carlton and St. Cloud, of course. All of these big cities and small towns, South St. Paul, pretty small town outside of St. Paul, are adaptively reusing buildings. And we know we have probably a surplus of perhaps warehouses and office space and other buildings, schools, banks even. And we also have housing needs throughout the state. And so this particular concept, or these workshops that past tense and future tense we're focusing on, will continue to have new and innovative reuse content of existing buildings. So again, Josh and I co-presented with a few others about for statewide Green Step Cities workshop in May. And Anne Marie from Rethos Central, Minnesota, also Stearns County Museum, we're co-presenting next week in St. Cloud. In fact, she and I just got interviewed by a local radio person who will be advertising this particular workshop. So I believe I am likely going to be speaking at the Reuse Minnesota conference on this topic. So if there are folks that have in Minnesota Call specifically, buildings that have been adaptively reused and you want to share those with me, please do so. I would love to find out more. I have a huge list of like 30 different buildings myself, but I'd love to hear from you. If you have buildings that have been adaptively reused that you've seen, that you've been in, that you know about, that you want me to feature and highlight, I would love to. So I'm really looking forward to going to St. Cloud next week and being able to talk about some of these buildings that Anne Marie from the Central Rethos Central location has been able to provide to me. So I get to learn while I'm teaching, which I think is oftentimes the best way to learn. And you are all welcome. It is in person. It's from 5:30 to 7 in St. Cloud on Tuesday, August 1st. And Anne Marie, do you want to, I know that you've put a few things into chat. Do you want to say a few words about that opportunity? Mic is not working. Sorry about that. I should have remembered. Okay. Well, check it out. I'm really looking forward to it. We'll probably provide an update in our next Gov Delivery newsletter about how that went. And another thing I didn't create a slide for is that in the last week or two, I've been getting more and more updates. It's okay, I can understand tech updates, tech problems. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been getting more and more updates from cities and counties that are starting to consider reuse, buildings, programs, sheds, whatever you want to call it, and try to do this from memory. I recently heard from Pope Douglas. They had actually sent out a news release. This is up in the Alexandria, Minnesota area, that they are breaking ground, about to break ground, broke ground, I forget, on their reuse building. And that is a trend that I'm seeing growing across the nation, and very specifically here in Minnesota. I had a chance with a bunch of others at a Reuse Minnesota event to take a look at the Dodge County, not too far from Rochester, Minnesota, their reuse building. And what's really neat about theirs is that they're partnering with the Habitat for Humanity Restore Rochester to be able to source materials, make sure that there's a proper flow, so that if there is a surplus, then those materials can go straight to that Habitat for Humanity Restore. I may not have all the details completely correct on that, but it shows it demonstrates the need and the benefits of having partners in these efforts. I've been talking with Ramsey County. They're building a future environmental services center, and we'll be connecting them with the Habitat for Humanity Restore director in New Brighton. So they're looking at building a new building in Roseville, which is very close to the Habitat for Humanity Restore in New Brighton, about a potential future relationship that can be built. So again, it's just a no-end insight for these potential opportunities that exist. Any questions? I forget to pause for questions sometimes. Okay, well, moving on. Talked about the toolkit going backwards accidentally. I really want to hear from you all. I would love to know if there are any projects that you're specifically working on that focus on adaptive reuse or deconstruction, or if there's a desire for that within your community. And this is not just Minnesota here, so this is kind of like an open forum in a sense. And the word at the very end of that blue box is type them in chat. Not sure how that happened, but we'd love to hear from you about your successes or the things that you're working on related to the built environment. What sort of things are you focused on around Minnesota and in your part of this world? So if folks want to take themselves off of mute, I do have a second follow-up question, but I wanted to give folks some space and time for this particular activity, because I know that a lot of people are working on things, and being able to hear from one another is extremely helpful for everybody, including myself.
I have a question.
Sure. What's that?
What deconstruction companies are in Minnesota?
That's a really good question. Christopher, who are you connected to? Out of curiosity. You don't have to say if you don't want to. Or if you have a lot of kiddos in the background, that's okay too. Yeah, so we have several companies, and there's probably organizations we don't know about. In the Twin Cities, we have Better Futures Minnesota. I believe they've been around probably the longest. It's a nonprofit that is also a workforce development program. So they teach people that are recently released from incarceration these skills that can earn them a living wage. So a lot of times, a lot of connections are made to Better Futures. They have a couple different crews too, so they can do work simultaneously. We have a newer organization, another nonprofit in Minneapolis, based out of Minneapolis, called Birch Group. And they've been on public radio, they've been on the news quite a bit. There was even a national podcast that we shared in our newsletter about their recent efforts. There are, I think there are 5 Habitat for Humanity Restores in Minnesota, or that serve Minnesotans that are right outside of the Minnesota boundary that offer deconstruction. So that's something that happens across the nation, is some of the Habitat Restores offer deconstruction. last I heard, about 10% of them do. So obviously not all of them do, but that's a pretty high percentage compared to the number of programs we have. There are a lot of people who've been given this skill set. I've been told that Summit Academy, which is one of the leading construction course organizations out there that teach construction courses, they embed an unbuilding aspect to their education. So if you think about it, whether a client changes their mind or the wrong item got delivered or a mistake was made and materials need to be salvaged for reuse, unbuilding is a skill set that is just as helpful and necessary as building. And some of our demolition companies have been trained or have that skill set where they can do either basic skimming of good materials like the doorknobs and all that, the keyholes that you see in this picture. And, you know, a lot of them will be salvaging for recycling wood or concrete or asphalt, shingles, stuff like that. So the list is larger than what we know of, which is why we're trying to support this all for reuse mapping tool so that we can highlight that and so that people across Minnesota can recognize that there are resources in their community, not just the Twin Cities. So check out that all for reuse map. It's just a snapshot in time right now, so it'll continue to grow. Good question. Are there other questions or other successes people wanted to highlight that they're working on or that they're aware of? Maybe they're not working on it, but others are. We can transition to the next question too, which this is a photo that I believe is from Bauer Brothers. I needed to stand in front of this photo or in front of these windows just to show the scale of what size of doors and windows are being salvaged for reuse. So there's not a lot of things that make me at 5'9" look particularly small, but these particular windows do. So I'm just kind of curious, what's the coolest old building you've seen? And, you know, where do you shop at building material reuse stores? Or what have you donated or bought from a particular building material reuse store? And this is open to anybody, so you don't have to be in Minnesota to answer this question. Just trying to highlight some of the successes of these opportunities.
I'm just gonna share, my kids' daycare moved into our old high school here in Moorhead. And so part of it's been converted into apartment buildings, but now this daycare, they're in where I think it used to be like the theater department. But they have this amazing, what would you call it, like a facade. And it's super intricate. It's got like pineapples and different types of fruits and leaves and, you know, some of that old style construction and artistry that they used to incorporate into buildings. And they have chandeliers and it's amazing and I love it. It's beautiful to look at.
Can you share with me, whether it's in chat or in an email, Crystal, information about that? Because I don't believe I'm aware of this. There's so many adaptive reuse opportunities that exist and successes, but I would love to learn more about this particular one. It sounds really
thank you.
cool.
I'll take pictures and send you. I'll get the permission to share. So I'm sure they would love to highlight it.
Excellent. I love taking photos or getting permission to use other people's photos, particularly for workshops like this or for our Built Environment newsletter, which does go out to over 3,000 people, and you can subscribe today. Kathy mentioned when walking in downtown Boston recently, I passed an old building that is still marked as Benjamin Franklin's birthplace. That is humbling. That is very, very neat. And of course, the East Coast, upper East Coast have much more historical buildings than we do. But, you know, we still have some that are, you know, up to 1700s old. So very cool. I did throw my email address into chat if anybody does have successes that they would like to share offline and to me directly. And we actually kind of powered through the last several topics rather quickly. We are actually at the end of today's meeting. So this is a time, if you have any questions, about the work we're doing, things that you've heard, initiatives you would like to see happen in Minnesota or maybe beyond, but focus on Minnesota here. Any last questions or thoughts before we end the meeting for today? And just know that change, particularly here in Minnesota, does not happen by accident, that it has taken a lot of people who've been at this industry for a long time. So even though someone had asked me earlier, you know, how long have we had a formal program? How long have we been doing some of these efforts? They well predate me. People that have been deconstructing, obviously people have been reusing building materials since we humans, you know, first came to be. And so part of it is actually doing what we've always done, which is to be smart by reusing materials when possible, landfilling as a last resort, and continuing the movement of a more circular economy. So it is a pleasure for us to be able to work with so many people here in Minnesota and outside of Minnesota on a lot of these efforts. So getting some more information being shared. The Wright Building, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, had an opportunity to deconstruct it. Okay. Built in April 2020. So you deconstructed from the 5th floor to the 3rd floor. Would it just not collapse? Maybe I'm just reading it wrong, but maybe you made it down to 3 stories from a 5-story building. One of the buildings, first newspaper released. On rooftop laundry, built-in nursery. Oh, that's really, really cool, Ashley. Thank you for sharing that story. Kathy is saying out in Massachusetts DEP, creating micro grants for deconstruction. Okay, excellent. Happy to share with you, Kathy, the developments. I think you've been connected to folks that are offering the deconstruction grants so far, but thought you're welcome to follow along and learn about what we're doing in future tense. So thanks everybody for joining. It doesn't look like there's any more questions, and so obviously no need to keep you here. So thank you all for joining us and presenting. This has been a great opportunity today, and we'll see you another time. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.